Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Dambusters, the podcast dedicated to exploring the rich, complex and often controversial history of RAF Bomber Command. I'm Jen Gulliford-Lowes, and along with my co-host James Jeffries, we delve deep into the stories, missions and people that shaped one of the most crucial components of the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. In today's episode, we are honoured to have a special guest, Eleanor Rance, joining us. Eleanor is a trailblazer. She was the first female Church of England chaplain in the Royal Air Force and the first ever female chaplain from HM Forces to deploy on operations. Her presence today promises to offer a unique and insightful perspective on the vital role of the chaplains who served with Bomber Command. Eleanor will share her knowledge and experiences, shedding light on the spiritual and emotional support provided to the thousands of airmen who flew in the most dangerous and often traumatic of circumstances. But first, what have you been up to, James? How has your January been thus far?
It's been pretty crazy, actually. So I've got PhD submission coming up. Not the final thing, because the PhD seems to take forever. But it's a section that I'm working on. And yeah, I've been researching that and trying to tidy it up and get that sorted. Still doing lots of reading that I probably don't have time for. But the rabbit hole with the US Civil War is still very much a thing. Back lecturing at Essex, which is great, but that means that there's absolutely tons of marking I'm doing at the moment, and I've got the Wolverhampton dissertations, which are really good. They're coming up as well, so yeah, I'm going to be tied to my desk pretty much for the next 4 or 5 weeks. But yeah, what about you, Jane?
I just thought that I was asking how January is going, but this episode will actually be going out probably mid-February or even later. But yeah, anyway. Yeah, massively busy with work in the real world. Book is finally going to print, thank goodness. So by the time this episode goes out, we should actually potentially have some physical copies. Seeing the proofs, it looks great, looks fantastic with all the colour maps and everything in it. Really chuffed with it. So yeah, getting on with that. I'm still trying to negotiate the complexities of the Norwegian banking system, but that's a whole other story. Just really busy and trying to get things sorted out for the Norway move, but there we are.
Exciting. Gosh, we've both been really busy, haven't we?
Yeah.
Well, we should, that brings us now to welcoming our guest, which is the Reverend Eleanor Rance. Jane and we've really been looking forward to this. And it's great to have you on the show, Eleanor. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm also in the midst of moving house, so lots of exciting things going on. But yeah, I'm delighted to be able to chat about this because it's a subject that is really important to me, and I think will probably interest quite a lot of your listeners too.
Definitely. Well, let's begin. Talk a little bit about yourself, your background. It's not often that we have a guest on the show who's has performed essentially the same role as your wartime contemporary. So yeah, you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you. So yeah, I joined the Royal Air Force in 1999, fresh out of my training years in the Church of England. So I was ordained in 96. I did 3 years in London, and then I had this crazy idea of being a chaplain. And at that time, obviously, female clergy were a new thing for the Church of England. Priests were, and you couldn't be a chaplain in the armed forces if you weren't a priest, because you can't perform communion and all of those sorts of things, which obviously are fundamental to chaplaincy. So it wasn't really a big surprise that my generation of people, I was 27 at the time, would be the ones breaking that particular glass ceiling. But it did mean that I ended up being the first female Church of England chaplain in the Royal Air Force. And that was an awesome experience. I loved it. I was in for 10 years. I travelled all the way around the country in a sort of corkscrew. So I started at Cosford, having done my officer training, went up to North Yorkshire. I was at Linton News. Then I went to RAF Coltishall. Then I went out to the Sunshine, to Iraq for 4 months. Then I came back to RAF Benson in Oxfordshire, went to headquarters at what was, of course, Bomber Command and now Air Command in High Wycombe, and then back up north to RAF Leeming. So I did a proper swirl around the country. And you're absolutely right. My hypothesis has always been that chaplaincy never really changes. And my fascination with the history of our branch came because we'd heard all about army chaplains. We knew the ones who had VC. We knew the ones who had laid down their lives in service. Nobody really knew about RAF chaplains. And I thought that was a bit weird. I thought surely they've been involved in the same conflicts as the army, certainly obviously from the end of the First World War. And so I set about researching it. And that carried on post my leaving the Air Force and coming back into civilian life.
Can you tell us a little bit about your service in operations and the sort of challenges that presented to you?
Yeah, so it's a natural part of service in the armed forces that you will deploy and you will be deployable. And so when my turn came to deploy overseas, we had been in Iraq for just over a year. So I went to Basra Air Station, as it was called at the time, in the May of 2004. And I didn't know at the time, but I surmised later and have had a conversation with my former chaplain-in-chief since then. But they agonised about deploying me because at that particular time, we just had the scandal of the fake images of torture of prisoners in prisoners of war. And so British personnel were not particularly well received in Iraq at the time. And there was significant concern about a female Christian chaplain being in convoys, being on the road, being over there. And so they did agonise about my safety and about also the knock-on of that, which is if you're focusing on someone else's well-being and safety, there's a risk that that's to the detriment of actually the operational effectiveness of the whole team. So that there were questions there. And so when I deployed, I had a slightly different approach to my previous chaplains who were all male. So I was based at the air station, which is just like, basically it was like living on an active airport for 4 months in a tent. And I didn't go on patrol with the boys, which my predecessors would have done, because it just blurred their boundaries. And also they'd had to protect me because I was non-combatant. So I stayed at unit level, but I was always available to anyone who was passing through or indeed was serving there. And that encompassed Army, Navy, Air Force, US personnel, occasionally other nationalities who came through the airport because it was the main route into and out of Iraq for all British Forces personnel and for the majority of other service personnel as well. And that also meant that I was responsible for overseeing repatriations during my time there. We lost 8 men while I was in Iraq, and I oversaw the preparations for the repatriation for all of them. Interestingly, in the UK, you would see those who had been killed in action being brought home. In theatre, we sent everybody home with a sunset ceremony. Their coffin was covered with the Union flag and prayers were said, and they were carried onto a waiting aircraft. So that was really, really important for us. And it was enormously important for their comrades, especially because inevitably they weren't able to go home for a funeral. They weren't able to grieve properly. So that was it was a small part, but a really, really key part of my role. And the rest of the time, it was very much what my mates of 80 years ago would have been dealing with. People who didn't want to be there, people who were having massive problems with relationships back home, people who were struggling with money and all the stuff that goes on at home. It just goes with you. But there's no social services, there's no SAFA, there's no welfare officers. It's the padre and the medics usually who have to deal with the admin support teams. And we were not as at risk as people who followed me and indeed as people who were involved in the opening part of the Optelic in 2003. But we did have mortar attacks on the airfield throughout my time there. And in fact, that started the night I arrived, and I didn't have body armour because it was at that time it was being issued in theatre. So it was a rude awakening to operational service. We were very fortunate; no one was injured, and no buildings were damaged during that period of time. Unfortunately, in subsequent months and years, people were in fact killed through attacks on that airfield. So. Yeah.
So let's go back in time then, 75, 80 years or so, Eleanor. Can you explain the role of the chaplain generally, but particularly the role of the military and RAF chaplains in the context of the Second World War?
Sure. So chaplaincy is fairly consistent across the generations and indeed right up to the current time. It's about spiritual support and welfare, but it's also about emotional support, I suppose, practical, tangible support. So you see the genesis of Royal Air Force chaplaincy in the last years of the First World War, when the Army Chaplains Department on the Western Front started to post their chaplains to RAF squadrons, or in fact, Royal Flying Corps squadrons. And then as they became the Royal Air Force, we had chaplains who were dedicated to looking after Royal Air Force personnel, but they were not yet RAF chaplains. And what was different for the RAF to the Army, and remains to a certain extent that now, was that whereas the Army tend to move with, they have a regimental padre or a brigade padre or whatever, with the Air Force, you had a unit padre. So you'd be based at a unit and you'd look after any of the squadrons and the ground crew and personnel who were attached to that unit. And so it was much more location-based ministry. Apart from that, the general themes were obviously spiritual support. So for those who had a Christian faith, they would be able to worship in their tradition by and large. And also they would be able to, be prepared for marriage or confirmation or any of those things. Those of other traditions who didn't have one of their particular chaplains, so if they're Roman Catholic, for example, and there wasn't a Roman Catholic chaplain nearby, those of other faiths were at that time and still are entitled to worship in their own tradition, in as long as it doesn't impact on the working routine. So, for example, a Jewish member of personnel could go to the local synagogue for prayers. And nowadays, obviously, Muslim personnel, Sikh and Hindu personnel can worship according to their traditions. So all of that was already allowed for during this period. Chaplains were deployable as well. So they went where their people went. And we had RAF chaplains all over the world. We had, therefore, also RAF chaplains who were taken prisoner by the Japanese, by the Italians. And we lost an RAF chaplain, in fact, in Borneo. We had a chaplain on D-Day on Omaha Beach, deployed with Mobile Radar Unit, RAF, and he received the Military Cross for his work there. So to be there for those who are injured and dying, of course, to be there for those who have got their girlfriend pregnant and don't know what to do, to be there for those who are really struggling with the morality of what they're doing or who are frightened, to be there with socks and sweets and setting up parties and the cinema. And I mean, chaplains were responsible for so many, the sublime to the ridiculous, so many different things, and still are today.
I just wanted to ask, why do you think there's so little written by and or about chaplains, especially in the Royal Air Force? I think the more well-known examples tend to be Army chaplains. When we think about chaplains and think about Arnhem, Normandy, I just wondered your thoughts on this.
Sure, you're absolutely right. When I started to look into this, it was about 2005, and I went all over the internet looking for books written by chaplains, RAF chaplains, and references to RAF chaplains in military literature, especially, obviously, things like people's memoirs and so on. So I think that there's sort of two halves to this. One is why chaplains didn't write about their exploits, or if they did, why they wrote the fun and exciting bits, the funny stories, the pull off a sandbag type stuff. And the other part of it is why people didn't refer to them very much in their accounts and why they're not recorded. So if you go to a squadron diary, operational record, digest, you will find references to chaplains, but it's kind of almost like, well, we have a doctor, we have a padre, it's not out of the ordinary. And I think the problem for us in our generation is it is out of the ordinary. The vicar doesn't get involved in everyday life like they did in the 1930s and 40s.
Very true.
So part of it is that it was so normal that you don't need to say, oh, and the chaplain was there. Now, when we read about it, we kind of think, oh my goodness, the padre was there. The padre that, I wanted to tell you a little bit about today. He was there at dispersal, every single operation. He saw his boys off and he saw them home, every single one. And that was ordinary for him. And he didn't write any of it down. None of it is written down by him. None of it. It's not recorded by him in his own voice. The other thing is that there's a tension, and I have experienced this for myself. I have just this last year been writing my experiences of my time in Iraq, in Basra. And I'm really torn as to whether is that for a future record or is it for family? Is it just because I need to get it out? There are bits that I can't write down because they don't belong to me. They belong to somebody else. They belong to the person who confided in me. There are things that I've seen in my ministry, broken bodies, people beside themselves with grief. That's not for public consumption. It's not my story. Yeah. And it is very, very difficult, therefore, to capture at the time what is going on. You get glimmers. And now, 80 years on, we're just beginning to claw back some of these stories from family members, if diaries are still in existence, in the Bomber Command archive. There are, accounts and references to people because they stuck in their minds and they can now speak about them. But contemporary stuff, very little.
Now, you've touched on one of the chaplains that you've researched there, and I know you've done a huge amount of research on one Bomber Command chaplain in particular. Can you tell us about George Martin, please, Eleanor?
Of course. So George is a really fascinating character, and the reason I know so much about him is because he kept a lot of documentation relating to his ministry, which he probably shouldn't have done, but we're very fortunate he did. But the other reason I know a lot about him is because I've met his son and daughter and interviewed them. So I've gathered additional information, and in some cases, especially from his son, who was a little boy with him while he was serving in the Air Force. George was born in 1901, and that's important, I think, because it means by the time the war came along, he was a mature, established person. He wasn't just an established person, but he was also an established priest because he, like me, was ordained age 24. And he served his first 3 years of ministry as curacy in London. And this is also important because he came from an everyday family. He came from a religious family, but his dad wasn't ordained. It happens that his brother was later ordained and also joined the Air Force as a chaplain, interestingly. But he was in London, in Hackney, and he absolutely loved people. This is one of the things his children have told me. He was just as happy chatting to, the barrow boy, to talking to the mayor or royalty. He was one of those people. He loved people and he was really engaging. After he'd spent that few years in London, he was called to the mission field and he joined the Church Missionary Society, which is an Anglican missionary organisation. And he went out to South Sudan. And then he came home to London. He trained as a teacher and he went back to Jerusalem and he was in a school in Jerusalem. And by this time, he was also married. His wife had been rushed off to do a nursing course by the Missionary Society and had joined him. And they had 2 small boys at the outbreak of the war. And he came home. And of course, by this time, he's 38. So he's not a youngster like all the people who were joining the Air Force to fly. And that is really, I think, is really key in his story. He signs up in the beginning of the war. So he's obviously come home specifically to do this. We don't know why he joined the Air Force. There's a possibility that he knew service personnel from his time in Jerusalem because obviously the expat community was quite strong. And so they used to go to the service clubs and socialise there. So that was a culture that he already understood. And that likewise, he may have been attracted to the Air Force, particularly for that reason. The chaplain's branch was remarkably sensible, I think, at this point. And it's not always the case, let's face it, in the armed forces. But they sent him back out to where he'd come from. So he went to the Middle East Command initially, and he starts in Amman. He then moves to let me think where he goes to. He goes back to Sudan, actually. He goes to Khartoum, and then he's made senior chaplain of the Levant. And during this period of time, he is involved in a conflict that takes place in Eritrea with the Italians. He loses aircrew over the whole of the area that he's operating in. He is responsible for burials, and he's mentioned in dispatches in September 1941. None of us have worked out why or what. And as you probably know, MIDs are really difficult to research. You have to try and pick out, that particular record and find it. That it's thought that he commandeered an aircraft to fly injured personnel home, and it's thought that the aircraft wasn't an RAF one. Might have been Italian. And if that's the case, an unarmed padre flying home injured personnel, it sounds extraordinary, but from what I've read and learned about him, it could well be true. So that's a question mark at the moment. And then 1943, he's called back home. So he's been out overseas for a long time. While he's been away, his family home has been hit by an incendiary bomb. But the family are all fine. They've just carried on as normal. So he comes back to the UK, and key for us is that he is posted to RAF Oakington, which is just outside Cambridge, in November 19. It's almost to the day, really, that he arrives in RAF Oakington that the Battle of Berlin is kicking off. So there he is on a unit with 7 Pathfinder Squadron. There are 2 Mosquito Squadrons. There's a Met flight. But obviously 7 Squadron is the real sort of focus of his ministry. And what he held on to from that period, he's there until the end of the war, as far as we can see. What he held on to from that period are a series of files, pretty much all his files from his office, I reckon. So he kept his operational digests that he was issued with every day. He kept signals that he received they would have been from the International Red Cross, for example. He kept all his correspondence from local people who were writing to him. I haven't delved deeply into that, but there's one letter that I have read where a lady writes and says, I find myself in a certain condition, and the man who is responsible has just been posted and won't answer my calls. So he was dealing with that sort of everyday pastoral stuff. He kept that file. He also kept a number of files of casualty lists. And these are in the Imperial War Museum, so they are readily accessible. And initially, you just look at these folders and you think, wow, that's a lot of names. But when you start to go through them, and I've gone through all of them now and made a database, basically, you find 530 odd names of casualties. So every day after the missions of the night before, obviously, as we know, lots of different people on a unit would have been given the casualty lists. So those casualty lists have the name, rank, etc. of each person on a particular aircraft. So 7 or 8 names, because obviously sometimes you had observers flying second pilot and so on. So you've got your 7 names, you've got their denomination, so what their religious affiliation is, or none. Sometimes they're agnostic or they have nothing written down. You have their next of kin details, and they're always next of kin. But sometimes there's more than one. So sometimes it's mother and sister, sometimes it's wife and parent, sometimes it's a brother, or sometimes it just says friend. Also friend, so an additional name and address. Against every single one of those names, George has ticked and written in pencil along the top, wrote on such and such a date. And in 90% of the cases, he writes that day. So if a mission is flown 19th, 20th, he writes on the 20th to every single person on that list, regardless of their denomination, regardless of whether they're a friend or a wife. He writes to every single person, and he keeps those lists. In subsequent months, if information comes through, for example, from a signal from the Red Cross, he annotates that list. And then he took every single one of them home with him at the end of the war. The other set of files that he had were all the letters that he received back from the next of kin and friends and contacts. From every letter is from somebody connected to one of the names on those lists. Those files are separate, but I have photographed and copied every single one and put them back together. So I now have a folder, a wallet for each flight. So each aircraft, you've got its tail number and everything else, obviously, and any correspondence relating to that particular trip. I've then cross-referenced that with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to see exactly what happened. And of course, that's where my experience of this journey separates from George's, because George didn't know, of course, what was going on. He knew bits. There are occasions when Met flight, for example, crashes. There's one episode where a Mosquito bursts into flames on takeoff. I think it said explodes in flames on his little note. And he then presides over the funerals of those casualties. His wife came and joined him for a year during this time, and his little boys. His daughter wasn't yet born. And from conversation with the family, we know that they hosted crews in the vicarage, because poor George was actually posted to the vicarage, not to the RAF unit. So he had to look after the parish as well as the whole of RAF Oakington. They'd have the boys round for tea and then they wouldn't come back. And so that was one of the things that his son, John Mike, remembers very strongly from that period, how his mother felt especially. Mike also remembers going up on the air traffic control tower and watching with his dad as aircraft took off. And letters from next of kin say, Padre Martin, my son always spoke very highly of you. He said how you were always waiting for them when they came home, and it gave them such comfort. So those letters and those lists tell an enormously powerful story.
Gosh,
yeah. Sorry, I'm running on. There's a lot there.
No, it's fantastic. We're absolutely loving this
Fascinating,
conversation. It's so important, though, because this stuff just doesn't normally get talked about. And it's really, really important in terms of the life of a bomber base, really. It's the sort of spiritual and the emotional and aspects of grief, etc. It's all, none of these things can be separated out from the overall parcel, if you like, of what's actually going on at the time. It's, you can't have one without the other. It's all sort of so
and
contiguous.
I think the other thing that it underscores is that Bomber Command experience was a shared experience with the whole nation. There were people who lived locally who, they didn't have family there, but inevitably there were relationships that sprung up and connections that were made, and the sort of web of very, very everyday things that bubble up in these letters. Poor chap. So what's really interesting for me is that I had to guess what he was actually writing to all these family members, because I had their letters but I didn't have his letters. And then I found there is actually one of his letters in the International Bomber Command Centre's archive. So it connects to a particular chap, Squadron Leader Wilson, and his wife has been written to by George Martin. And he, I suspect, said the same thing in every letter. But, even just reading one of his letters was striking, because, of course, it's handwritten, obviously. This wasn't typed up by some girl in the typing pool and then signed by him. He wrote by hand every letter. But there's some other things in that letter that are really powerful. He refers to the fact that they have family. That's not written on the casualty list. He knew that this man had children, and he wrote it in the letter. He acknowledges straight away that they must be feeling anxiety and, all of the things that are going on with not knowing whether someone is dead or alive. He offers hope. He then offers tangible support. He says, if there's anything that I can help you with, please do not hesitate to be in touch. Now, they've already received a telegram, a letter from the commanding officer, etc., etc. This is not the only correspondence that next of kin have received. But the Padre has not just caring for the boys and girls on his unit. He's caring for all these families who are not just all over England, they are all over the world. Because he's writing to Canada, he's writing to New Zealand, he's writing to Australia, he's writing to Jamaica, South Africa, and then he gets all the letters back and he has to respond to those. And they're also annotated with the date that he responds. And the questions are, obviously, do you have any tiny piece of information? Did anyone see what happened? Could you give me any hope? But then I want to know if you can give me the names and addresses of the rest of the crew families, because I want to be in touch with them. Interesting now, that just would not be possible, would it? But then it was an instinct, and often he was the person who sent that information. Then it's what's going to happen with his things. They've been told what's going to happen with the things, but they want to know from the Padre. And then it's, what about his bicycle? What about his dog? There's one letter where the wife says, could someone put the dog on the train and on the guards van and I'll pick it up at the other end? There's anxiety about cars being transported back to home. Questions about, there's two particularly poignant letters where there's one where a mother says that her husband always puts by some sweeties for the children. And she wonders whether there might be some in his room. And she knows that his effects are going to be taken and sent away. But she just wonders. And George has written on the letter that the things were sent. And I just thought, I know he's going to do that. Once you get it into the head of this person, you're thinking, yes, of course, he sent the sweeties to these kids. He made sure that they were reassured. And actually, I know that particular gentleman came home. He became a prisoner and came home.
Gosh.
The other one, which is particularly poignant for me, and there are so many, but this one is, unfortunately, a young man who was killed, and George was responsible for his funeral. So he was killed in the UK. And as at this moment in time, I can't quite remember the circumstances, but he was from either New Zealand or Australia. He had no parents alive anymore. And he was engaged to a WAF who was stationed elsewhere. I think she'd gone over toward Wales at this stage. And she writes in her letter to him, as you know, we were due to be married in a couple of weeks' time. On our last leave, we went and bought my wedding ring. It's in a small brown box in his things, and I just wonder if it could be sent to me. And she also asks if she could have her letters to him back. And George writes on the letter to say, told the adjutant to send them to her. Those moments, the other thing with that letter, which is heartbreaking, is that the CO has written to the WAF as well to tell her the date of the funeral, but she doesn't get the letter until after the funeral has taken place.
Oh, gosh.
And I kind of think, why didn't they send the telegram?
Yeah.
And I've been to some of the graves in Cambridge City Cemetery, and at the crematorium in Cambridge, where George Martin presided over funerals, and I've taken flowers because those names mean something to me, now. Those young men, the Canadian and Australian and New Zealand families' experience, of course, is very different. And I think that's something else that comes through from the letters. Canadians, there's not such a long lead to them. Obviously, they get the telegram, but then the time is not so long. But for the Australian and New Zealand families, it can take quite a long time. You can see the trail with obviously the date of their letters. It takes some time for that information to get out to them, and then some time for their response to come back. But I think also the physical distance just means their experience of the whole thing is so different. They've already said goodbye to their son or their loved one a long time ago, and they are very far away from what is happening. You've got dads in the UK who are away from their wives because they're on war work or have been bombed out of their homes. Families in Australia and New Zealand are writing saying, we're really feeling for you in England here. And you're thinking, but, you've just been told your son's gone missing. So there's a dissonance there and a disconnect, which is totally understandable. So that's incredible. And I think the other thing that's really powerful and really gets you a little bit overwhelmed, well, me overwhelmed anyway, is the fact that sometimes, apart from those who are killed and die in the UK, sometimes families do find out that their loved one has died because, of course, the Germans were sending back the token list through the Red Cross. And that's particularly poignant that they already know. Or then when I go onto the CWGC website and find a whole crew in the same grave, half the names on the Runnymede Memorial and half not, things like that, and reading the headstones as well, which I've also done a study of, or I've begun a study of, and the inscriptions. There's one that really stands out to me, and it accords with the letter that the family wrote. One parent who says, we haven't lost one boy, we've lost 7. For them, the whole crew were their children. They'd come to know them and they felt that that's significant a loss. And they actually put something on the headstone to that effect. And I just think that is, it doesn't matter that it's 80 years ago. It could be yesterday. You feel that agony and that loss. And there's a lady who writes to Padre Martin saying, I've been asked about his laundry number. I found a handkerchief or something and his laundry number is this, because of course that was another thing that was being done. They were trying to identify remains with tiny fragments of information and evidence. And there's George Martin in the middle of all of this, trying to help weave these things together and sustain his existing community. So he did go flying as well. We did go flying on missions. I think that was for morale. But again, interestingly, not listed in the operational record, except after the conflict had ended, because we know that he flew, his family know that he flew over Dresden, not on the nights of the actual raid, but afterwards. He also went into Bergen-Belsen. I'm pretty sure it's Bergen-Belsen. She never talked about with his family. But he also went to Holland when they were taking supplies after the end of after the E-Day, and he's listed on the manifest as second pilot, which I
wonderful.
That was great. Yeah, so he's there. But that was not uncommon for chaplains. They were occasionally asked to fly with a crew that were a bit nervous. We actually had a gunner as well, who an air gunner who was a padre, but he was also qualified, and he actually had his brevet, and he used to fly with crews. Not sure if he actually operated a machine of any kind.
Yes, I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's a whole other story about chaplains, and certainly the rules have not changed. The Geneva Convention states that if the government allows chaplains to bear arms for their own self-defense and for the defense of those in their care, then they may. So some countries do that. Like medics, it's the same basic principle. Our government has not allowed us to do that, except during the Second World War, I interviewed a chaplain once who had served in India. And because obviously it was a slightly different setting with the threat from the Far East, the Japanese threat, they were given the choice. They were told they could carry a weapon if they wanted to. He chose not to. Anyway.
Wow, that's just incredible. I'd like to sort of just dip in here and mention an experience that I'm aware of with regard to my uncle's crew, which I've written about. My uncle was a wireless operator on 10 Squadron, Halifax Squadron, and they had a very, very close-knit crew, but one of the crew was called upon to replace a navigator who was sick and to go on an operation with a different crew one night. This would have been in October of 43. And he went up with them and they crashed on the return journey, and he was killed and the aircraft blew up on impact. And I actually managed to speak to an interview the tail gunner of the crew, a gentleman called Bill Bradshaw, and I asked him about Roy's death and sort of how it impacted them, and he said it was just so strange. It just, from like being there all the time, all of a sudden he just wasn't there anymore. And he said that the padre, that the chaplain, came round and spoke to each of them individually and came and sat on the end of their bed and had a good chat with them about that. And he said after that they all felt a little bit better about it. But with regard to the morality issue as well that you touched upon earlier, the pilot of this crew, Reg Pennicott, he was a Roman Catholic, a very, very devout one. And he, I know, struggled throughout the course of his tour of operations with the morality of what he was doing. So much so that, again, Bill Bradshaw actually found him praying before one operation when he went to go and get him, said, you know, it's time to go and get your kit on, kind of thing. And he found him praying by his bed. And he said, "Oh, are you praying for our safe return?" And he said, "No, I'm praying for the German people." I found that quite difficult to deal with, actually.
Yeah. I think, I mean, it's interesting. I think Miles Tripp writes about this, doesn't he?
Yeah.
In his
The Passenger.
His fictional and non-fiction version of his experience, and he talks about it with in relation to Dresden in particular, and how he had to grapple with that. And I think he, you know, it's quite shocking that when he goes back and chats with all his former crew members later, he doesn't actually sort of explicitly say, but he finds it quite challenging, I think, that a lot of them just didn't really engage. And I think that for some, they just felt they had to just get on with it.
Yeah. I think everyone's experience was different, wasn't it? And you can't sort of, you know, generalize about it, because everyone dealt with it and thought about it and about the morality of what they were doing and the practicalities, etc., in a completely different way. I mean, even, you know, as you've just said, on the same crew, you could have 7 different opinions on, you know, on what was taking place.
And I think they also, some were motivated by their experiences at home.
Yeah.
You know, there are sort of references, aren't there, where people have lost their family members, you know, that they've gone home on leave and, you know, they've experienced the loss of wives, children, whatever. They've seen the family home blown up, and that's generated that desire to seek revenge. So sometimes it is about vengeance, but in a very kind of almost legalistic way. And I think, you know, the other part of that is that there are those who just cannot compute what's going on.
Yeah.
And then when they do see what's going on, what do they do with that? You know, that you can't. I've talked to chaplains, former colleagues of mine, about their experiences of working with aircrew flying operations, and one of the things that I talk to new chaplains about is the issue about proximity. And proximity, it's not quite on the same footing as the sort of morality and the ethics of the bombing campaign, but this part of the Second World War was so different, wasn't it, to, you know, the First World War especially. But, you know, we've always had camp followers, but these were people who were coming home. There were WAFs who were listening for their boyfriend, their husband even, flying home, and knowing that aircraft that's just been, we've just seen so-and-so go down. They knew who that person was. They were in a relationship with them. There's that huge sort of tension about, you know, the lady who does the washing, the person at the pub. Everybody was drawn into this normal life of these young men. And that experience was very, very new in the Second World War. But it's still there today. And it's there today in a very, you could say, in a very different way, but with the Reaper crews who operate in this country and in America, but over hostile territory. Others who have flown on missions so when we were in the Balkans and in Kosovo, flying from Germany, the crews actually experienced the same tensions because they were coming home at the end of a mission to their wife and kids and taking the kids swimming and, helping with homework, and they couldn't do it because they knew that they'd just been on a mission where they'd had to drop ordnance over, hostile territory. So those tensions and those issues are really complex. And I think for a chaplain, for me as a chaplain, when I joined the Air Force, people said to me, why should armed forces have chaplains? Surely it's against all that, we believe in. And I said, well, it's not as simple as that. And it's certainly not something that you can sum up in 5 minutes. But people need to have the opportunity to grapple with those questions and the space to do it safely. But at the same time, they don't want the lid taken off Pandora's box. Yeah. Because if you start down that path, where can you go with it? Unfortunately, the RAF came up with LMF, and what's really interesting to me, and I'd like to explore this further at some point in the future, is that it's rare, again, that you have anything recorded about engagement with the chaplain around LMF. So nowadays, you'd think, well, they'd go to the doctor, they'd go to a counsellor, they'd go to, maybe the padre would be involved in it. No, not part of the role. And yet, actually, those very questions, especially when they were about the morality of what we were doing and the fear of this persistent night after night, week after week role, those conversations must have been bread and butter for chaplains. They must have been.
And what about the impact of all of this on the chaplains themselves post-war? How did they go back to ordinary life, if you like?
That's such an important question, isn't it? I think just like air crew probably found it really difficult for some to adjust and go back to what was before. So too did clergy. They're just people at the end of the day. I know that for me, coming back from my operational tour, especially, it was really challenging to adjust. But in the longer term, as I said earlier, there are things that you don't want to forget and ignore and leave behind, but you also don't really feel it's appropriate to share with other people. They become your little, in a way, they become your tiny war wounds. They're hidden away and tucked away. And virtually every service person has something that they don't share readily and widely. I think the fact that George Martin left the Royal Air Force at the end of the war, went back to Sudan, spent the rest of his ministry right up until, virtually until he died, in the church, serving the church, but he kept all those files, all those years. He didn't leave them behind. He didn't burn them. He didn't tell anyone about them either. The family found them after his death and they were amazed that they were there. But I just feel, how could you let all that stuff go? How could you let those letters go, those names, those people? He knew them. I don't know them, but he knew those families. He knew those children. He knew those devastated fiancés. He'd officiated at some of their weddings, the couples who were married and had small children. He couldn't let them go. And his children tell me that after the war, because he went back to Sudan and he'd obviously served there during the war, there were cemeteries in that whole region where he would go. So he went back to Eritrea with his daughter and they had to get special permission to travel to a particular location. And he went to the cemetery and his daughter tells very movingly of how they went round and he knew all of this particular group of young men by name and he prayed at each grave. And his son Michael tells of another episode just before he had his national service, actually, where it was Remembrance Sunday and he went with his dad to this tiny cemetery out in the middle of nowhere in Sudan, and his dad took the service there. And they were people he knew. They weren't just like we have the experience of those stunningly beautiful, poignant places. They were boys that he knew. And that never, ever leaves you.
Yeah.
And I think, in a way, carrying it with you is the last part of service, if you like, especially when you haven't been able to, the myriad of those all across Europe. I don't think he went over to Europe to visit, but he'd have been going to pretty much every single war cemetery from the Second World War, inevitably right across Europe. And it's just unthinkable, really. It's so hard to imagine. So I think his last offering of service to them was to hold on to those precious files. Yeah.
Sadly, we do have to wrap up, but I've had a thought. We talk about wanting this mini-series of Bomber Command, sort of 10-part Band of Brothers thing. I think a chaplain character would be incredible in there, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Talking about a lot of the things we've discussed. And
central character, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. And like you said, there's not been a lot. I can think of a chaplain in the Bomber Harris ITV TV film. But otherwise, I'm struggling to think of an appearance. You think of a mini-series like Piece of Cake doesn't have a chaplain in it or something like that, or the book. And I'm just thinking, that could be an incredible window into this story, having a character like that in this mini-series we want.
Yeah, well, go for it. They definitely were there with the rum and the chocolate at the end of missions. They were there seeing doors off. They were there in all sorts of contexts.
Yeah.
It would have to be really, really well written.
Absolutely, yeah.
A kind of Dick Emery character.
Good Lord. No. Definitely not. Well, yes, thank you so much, Eleanor. That was incredible and very moving. You've been an absolutely wonderful guest. We've got more on the way. I think our next episode is Alan Allport talking about the official histories. I think we've got a Q&A coming up as well, which we've had some incredible questions, haven't we? Ones that I'm really scratching my head over.
Yeah.
That's going to be incredible. Yeah, Jane, anything else to add?
No, just to say that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Ella. To be honest, I'm in bits after that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I am.
Wonderful. Yeah.
That's incredibly powerful. Yeah. Gosh.
So I just want to say thank you as well to all of our listeners from around the world for tuning in. We've got listeners from the Falkland Islands to northern Norway, from Cape Town to Tokyo, and just about everywhere in between. I think we now listened to in 99 countries and territories around the world, which is absolutely wonderful. Now, we would greatly appreciate it if you could leave us a review or a star rating on your preferred podcast platform. It does make a massive difference, and it also helps other people find us too. If you would like early access to episodes, as well as live streams and Q&A sessions, please consider subscribing for just £2.40 or about $3 a month. You can find the link in our show notes or visit nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com. Don't forget to join our Facebook discussion group as well, which is open to all listeners, and follow us on our social media channels. You can also send us a message now by clicking on the Send Us a Message button at the top of the show notes. So we'll see you all again next week for another fascinating discussion, no doubt. Thank you for listening. Bye.